In the last video, we talked about query selectors, and the video before that, we talked about ID and class selectors. And in this video, we're going to talk about how you can hook up event listeners onto objects and buttons and things on your page in order to make it interactable. And again, I just have a blank HTML page to start with. And the first thing that I want to do is I just want to create a button. And this button is just going to say, click me. And in order to select this, let's just say data button on here. I prefer to use data attributes when selecting elements with JavaScript, just so they don't clash with my CSS classes. So we have a data button that says click me. And right now you can click it as much as you want and it's not going to do anything. So let's make it do something. First, we need to select that button. So we'll just say button is equal to document.querySelector. And we know that this has that data attribute, which is data button. So now we have our button, and just to make sure this is working, we can say console.log of our button, and you can see down here we have our button selected. So that's perfect. Now the next thing we want to work on is how do we add an event listener to that? Well, in JavaScript, it's actually incredibly easy. We just say button dot, and we call a method on the button, and this method is going to be add event listener. So we're just accessing this button object and calling the add event listener function on it. And inside of here, this is going to take two different properties that we need to deal with. The first argument that this takes is the name of the event you want to listen for. So as you can see, there's going to be a ton of different events we could listen to. For example, we could listen to mouse enter, and every time our mouse enters, this is going to be called. But the main event we want to deal with is click, because obviously we want to deal with something when we click on this button. And then the second property of this function is going to be a function that you actually run every single time that this event happens. So let's just use an arrow function here. So you can see we have our arrow function syntax, and inside this arrow function, whatever we put is run every time this event fires. So every time we click on our button, this function we write here is going to be called. So let's just say console.log clicked. So now when I click on the button, you can see it logs out clicked to the console, and it's going to do that every single time that I click on this button, because we're setting up this event listener that says every time we click the button, run this code inside of here. And the nice thing about event listeners is you can add as many as you want. So let's just copy this down and have another event listener that says clicked to. And both of these are going to run at the same time. When we click, it's going to go this one and then this one. So let's show that. When I click this button, you see it says clicked and then clicked to. Click it again and it says clicked and clicked to. So it's just running these events in the order that I add them to the button, which is really, really useful. This means that if you already have some form of click event on your button and you add another one, it's not going to overwrite. They're both going to get added and they're both going to run just fine. So now let's look at how we would remove an event from a button, because right now we can add an event listener, but how do we remove an event listener? Well, it's actually fairly straightforward. We just take our button and we call a new function, which is called remove event listener. And inside of here, you tell it what type you want. In our case, this is a click event. And then we just need to pass it the function that we're using. But right now we're using anonymous functions, and we can't just copy this down here. That's not actually going to work, because this function down here, while it looks the same, is technically a different function than this one up here, because they're both defined in different places. So we need to create one overall function. We'll just say function print click. And all we're going to do inside of here is the console.log clicked. Whoops. There we go. And then I just want to pass that function to our event listener. So we'll say print click. Let's just get rid of everything else, get rid of this down here, save, and just make sure this works. When I click, you see it's taking this print click, it's calling that function, and then it's logging out that I've clicked. And to remove that, all we do is pass a reference to the exact same function. So we can say print click, now it's removed. So now when I click the button, you can see nothing happens because we add the event listener and then immediately remove it. So obviously there's no event listener when we click on it, so it does nothing. Now, one really nice thing about events in JavaScript is they give you an event object, which you can use to do a ton of different stuff. So let's just come back here, get rid of this remove, get rid of this print click function. And in here, we're just going to do an anonymous function. That's an arrow function. And like I said, this is actually getting passed an event object. A lot of times you're going to see this referred to as E, which stands for event. So you could write it as E, or write the full thing as event. Generally though, you'll see this as an E. And let's take a look at what this event object is. So we'll just print out E. And when we save and we click our button, you can see we get this mouse event down here, which has a ton of information inside of it. Let me just expand this up so we can see. You can see it has a ton of information about the keys that you clicked, the position that you clicked was, the mouse, whether you're holding down control or not, whether it was a left or a right click. Tons of different information is going to be inside of here, whether you're holding down shift. And it also tells you the target, which is the actual thing that is triggering this event. In our case, this is the button that we're clicking on. So that is our target of this event. This target is really useful, especially if, for example, you want to check to see if an input is valid. Let's do that real quick. Let's create an input. So we'll say input type of text. And all we're going to do is just select that input. So let's just give it here, data input text, just so we can select this. Const input equals document dot query selector of data input text. There we go. We have our input being selected right here. And now what I want to do is we'll just remove this button code. We'll comment it out for now. We don't actually need this. What I want to do is set up an event listener that's going to check every single time I type a character inside of this box. Well, to do that, we're going to add an event listener. And with inputs, there's a few different types of events that you have. The most common one that you'll see a lot is going to be the change event. This is going to occur whenever the input changes. And inside of here, we're just going to call a function. We'll just say console.log changed. And let's see what happens. We start typing in here. You'll notice nothing happens, but as soon as we click off of the input, you'll see the change event fires. So it only fires after you finish changing the input and click off of the input to go somewhere else. If you want to actually run an event every single time you type a character, what you need to add is an event listener called input. What this means is you specified some type of input into your text input, whether that's typing a character, deleting a character, pasting text, whatever it is, you did something. And in here, we're going to just put out input. So now, every time that I type a character, remove a character, doesn't matter what I do, it's calling this input event listener here because it's saying you supplied some form of input to this, text box here. So what we can do is simply write a small check. We can see if our input has a value or not. So inside of here, let's just get our event, and we want to get the target of our event, which is our input. So e.target, this is essentially the same as input up here, and we just want to get the value. And we're going to say if the value is equal to an empty string. We're just going to check if it's an empty string or not. So it's going to be true if it's empty and false if it's not. So let's save and let's type. You can see we're getting false being printed out a bunch. And as soon as we have an empty input, we're going to get true being printed out. So we're able to really easily check whether or not our input has a value or if it doesn't have a value. Now let's take this a step further. Let's actually create a form. So we're just going to have a simple form here, which has our input and our button inside of it. And we're just going to set this button here to be submit. So it'll submit our form for us. And for our form, let's just say data form. So we can select this inside of our code. Now in here, let's get our form. We'll say const form equals document dot query selector of data form, just like that. And now what we want to do is we can remove all this code for these event listeners. We don't need the button or the input anymore. We just want to check what happens when we submit our form. So we can say form.add event listener, and this event listener is for the submit event. And what this says is anytime we submit a form, whether that's clicking the submit button, hitting enter inside of a text box, whatever it is, whatever causes you to submit your form, this is going to run this event here. And inside of here, we're just going to use the event object, and then we're just going to say console.log submitted form. And you're going to notice something interesting. Let's type something in here. We'll click submit. You'll notice it flashed down here, but then it went away. That's because by default, a form, when you submit it, is going to submit the form to wherever it's going. In our case, we didn't specify a location, so it's going to submit the form to the current page that we're on, which causes our page to essentially refresh with the values from our form. Obviously, we don't want that behavior though. So in order to prevent the default of a normal action, in this case, the submit action, by default is going to refresh your page and submit the form data. We don't want that. So we can call a method on our event called prevent default. And this is a function. It takes no arguments. And all it does is it says, I see what your event is supposed to do. I don't want you to do that though. So prevent the default, in our case, submitting the form, and just do the code that I wrote instead. Now, if we save, type something in, click here, you'll notice our text shows up at the bottom. It doesn't refresh our page and everything works as we want. We essentially prevented the default of this. The same thing happens with a link. When you click on a link in a web browser, it redirects you to a new page. But if you prevent the default behavior of that by listening to that click event and preventing the default, you can prevent the page from actually going to the new link. So I want you to try that out actually. What I want you to do is add a anchor tag to the HTML, and when it is clicked, prevent the default and log something to the console. And this anchor tag can go anywhere. You can put this, going to Google, just any site at all. Doesn't matter what it is, just make it go somewhere. And whenever you click on it, make it prevent the default so that it doesn't actually redirect you. So pause the video here, try that out, and I'll show you how it's done. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to do that. Let's just come in here. We're going to create an anchor tag, which an href. This href is just going to go to, let's just say https://google.com. We'll just say go to Google. Close that off. There we go. So now we have a link that is going to head to Google. And of course in here, make sure I save that. So now if I refresh the page, you can see we have a link. And when I click on this, it's going to bring us to Google. So what we want to do is make that not actually happen. So to do that, we need to select our link first. So we'll say const link is equal to document.query selector. And we can just say select all the A tags because it's the only thing on our page. So that's going to work just fine. Then we want to add an event listener on click because this is the thing that we want to prevent the default of. We want to get the event, and all we need to do is say e.prevent default. And let's just say console log prevented default. Now, what I do, I click on this link, you'll notice it doesn't actually redirect me, and all it does is log out prevented default. Now, this is obviously something you probably don't want to do in a real site because links should actually go somewhere, but it's really useful, for example, with form submissions or if you need to prevent default for other things on your page. And that's the majority of what you need to know about adding event listeners. You just need to put the type of the event here, and then you have the actual event that's going to run each time that event fires. Here's your function. So I'm going to run past a few different types of events that you can listen for. For example, we have mouse enter. And if we come over here, every time our mouse enters, you can see that we get that function running, which is just saying prevented default. We also have mouse leave, which what this is going to do is it's going to say whenever our mouse leaves the object, it's going to call this function. We also here have mouse over. And now what's going to happen is anytime that we're over the object, it's going to run this event. And then we also have focus. This one is interesting. It means whenever this thing receives focus, whether you tab onto it like this, or whether you click on it, this is giving focus to that object, so that is causing that event. And the opposite of focus is blur. Essentially, if we are on this, as you can see, I tabbed onto it and we tab off of it, it's going to cause the blur because it's saying you had focus and then you lost focus. And when you lose focus, this blur event runs. Finally, the very last type of event I want to talk about, we already discussed a little bit, and that is on the window itself. It is the resize event. And in here, we can just say console.log resize. And now whenever I resize this window, you can see this resize event is firing. Those right there are pretty much all of the most common types of events you're going to run into. There's a ton of other ones besides those, but those are the ones that you're going to use in 99% of use cases. And if you ever do need one of those more unique ones, it's pretty easy to look them up for when you need them. Now in the next video, we're going to dive back a little bit and talk about the differences between arrow functions and normal functions because they actually behave a little bit differently when dealing with scoping, and this is something that's really easy to see with this add event listener. So I can't wait to see you in that video.